I arrived at Fire Watchtower 47 on a Monday morning in late June, my boots crunching on the gravel path that led to the base of the structure. The tower rose above me like a solitary sentinel, 70 feet of weathered wood climbing toward the clear blue sky. A slight breeze rustled through the surrounding pines, carrying the sweet scent of sap and summer warmth. My duffel bag grew heavier with each step as I began climbing the spiral wooden staircase. The steps creaked under my weight, announcing my arrival to anyone who might be waiting at the top. Sweat beaded on my forehead by the time I reached the halfway point, and I paused to catch my breath, looking out at the vast expanse of forest stretching in every direction. Green treetops swayed gently below me, creating a living carpet that seemed to breathe with the wind. "Harris, about time you showed up," a gruff voice called from above. I looked up to see Leo Shepard leaning over the railing of the observation deck, his ranger hat casting a shadow over his weathered face. I raised my hand in greeting and continued my climb, my legs burning from the exertion. When I finally reached the top landing, Leo stood waiting, arms crossed over his chest. He was a tall man with the kind of leathery skin that came from decades in the outdoors, his salt and pepper hair cropped close to his head. His uniform looked as if it had been pressed that morning despite the remote location. "Welcome to your home for the next 2 weeks, Leo said, extending a calloused hand that I shook firmly. "Let's get you settled." The cabin at the top of the tower was small but functional, a single room with windows on all sides offering a 360-degree view of the surrounding wilderness. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall, a small kitchenette occupied another, and a desk with radio equipment dominated the center of the space. Leo wasted no time getting to business. "Your job is simple, Harris. You scan for smoke, you monitor weather patterns, and you make radio reports twice daily. 0700 and 1900 hours. Got it?" "Yes, sir," I replied, setting my duffel bag on the floor beside the cot. Leo walked me through the equipment, showing me how to use the radio, the weather instruments, and the high-powered spotting scope mounted on a tripod near the desk. "Forest is dry this year," Leo said, pointing toward the eastern section. "We've already had 2 small fires in that region. Keep your eyes peeled." He tapped his finger on a laminated map spread across the desk. "Any questions?" I shook my head, taking in the simplicity of my duties. Scan, monitor, report. I could handle that. "Good," Leo said with a nod. "I'll be back in 2 weeks. Radio if there's an emergency, but otherwise, stick to the schedule." He moved toward the stairs, then turned back. "And Harris, try not to go stir-crazy up here. Happens to some folks their first time." With that parting advice, Leo descended the stairs, leaving me alone in my new temporary home. I listened as his footsteps faded, followed by the sound of an engine starting and then growing distant as he drove away. I spent the rest of that first day unpacking my belongings and familiarizing myself with the equipment. The spotting scope was powerful enough to see miles into the distance, allowing me to scan large sections of forest for any signs of smoke or fire. The radio crackled occasionally with chatter from other rangers and fire crews, but mostly there was silence. My first 2 days passed uneventfully. I fell into an easy routine of scanning the horizon, checking weather readings, and making my scheduled reports. The solitude didn't bother me. I'd always been comfortable with my own company, and the panoramic views made for a constantly changing landscape to observe. Sunrise and sunset were particularly spectacular from my elevated position, painting the sky in colors no artist could fully capture. On the 3rd night, I was sitting at the desk reviewing my notes when I heard it, heavy footsteps in the underbrush below the tower. The sound was unmistakable against the normal nighttime forest ambiance of chirping insects and occasional owl calls. I set down my pen and listened more intently. The footsteps continued, accompanied by the sound of branches snapping and leaves rustling. Someone was definitely down there, and from the erratic pattern, they weren't moving with the confidence of someone who knew where they were going. I grabbed my flashlight from the desk drawer and stepped out onto the observation deck that wrapped around the cabin. The night air was cool against my face as I leaned over the railing, pointing my light toward the source of the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the clearing at the base of the tower. A man stumbled into the circle of light, his clothes torn and dirty. He had no backpack, no water bottle, none of the basic gear any hiker would carry. He shielded his eyes from the sudden brightness, looking up toward me. "Hello?" he called, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "Is someone up there? I need help." I swept the light across the surrounding area, checking for anyone else, but saw only trees swaying gently in the breeze. "I'm coming down," I called back, keeping my flashlight trained on him as I made my way to the stairs. The descent felt longer than it had that morning, each step taking me closer to the stranger who had appeared from nowhere. As I reached the bottom of the staircase, I kept a cautious distance between us. Up close, I could see he was a man in his mid-30s with disheveled brown hair and wide, anxious eyes that darted around nervously. His jeans were torn at the knees and his t-shirt had a long rip across the chest. Despite the warm June night, he was shivering. "Thanks for coming down," he said, his voice quavering slightly. "I'm lost. Been walking for hours trying to find my way back to the campground." "I'm Teddy Harris," I said, keeping my flashlight pointed slightly away from his face but still illuminating him enough to see clearly. "I'm the fire watch operator here." "Jacob," he replied. "Jacob Franklin." He extended his hand, which I shook briefly, noting how cold his fingers felt despite the mild temperature. "Which campground are you trying to find?" I asked, mentally reviewing the map of the area. Jacob ran a hand through his hair, looking over his shoulder into the darkness behind him. "Pine Ridge," he said after a pause that felt too long. "I went for a hike this morning and got turned around." Something about his story didn't add up. Pine Ridge Campground was well marked and only 2 miles from a main road. Even if he had gotten lost during a day hike, it seemed unlikely he'd end up here, miles from any established trail. "You're pretty far off the beaten path," I said, watching his reaction carefully. "How long have you been out here?" Jacob shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his fingers fidgeting with the torn edge of his shirt. "I'm not sure," he said, glancing over his shoulder again. "It feels like forever. I just want to get back to camp." I noticed how he kept looking behind him, as if expecting someone to emerge from the trees at any moment. His nervous energy was palpable, making me increasingly uneasy. "Did you come alone?" I asked, sweeping my flashlight beam around us once more. "Yes," Jacob answered too quickly. "I'm alone, just need directions." I studied him for a moment longer. His clothes weren't just torn. They looked like they'd been through much more than a day hike gone wrong. And there was something in his eyes, a haunted look that made me wonder what he'd seen or experienced out in these woods. "The campground is about 4 miles that way," I said, pointing east. "Follow the main trail with the yellow markers. It'll take you straight there." Jacob's eyes followed my gesture, and he nodded rapidly. "Yellow markers." "Got it. Thank you." He took a step backward, still facing me, his body language suggesting he was eager to leave. The way he kept glancing around made my skin crawl. Whatever had happened to Jacob Franklin out in these woods, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Do you need water or anything before you go?" I offered, partly out of genuine concern and partly to see how he'd respond. "No," he said, already backing away toward the tree line. "I'll be fine now. Thanks for your help." I watched as Jacob turned and hurried toward the trees in the direction I'd indicated. His footsteps faded into the darkness, leaving me alone again at the base of the tower, with an unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach. I pointed toward the main trail, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate the yellow markers attached to tree trunks along the path. 4 miles east, following those yellow markers," I said. "You can't miss Pine Ridge Campground if you stick to that trail." Jacob Franklin nodded, his wide eyes reflecting the flashlight beam. His torn shirt fluttered slightly in the night breeze. "Thanks," he mumbled, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper. He backed away from me, never turning his back, those anxious eyes still darting over my shoulder into the surrounding forest. I watched as he finally turned and hurried toward the trees, disappearing into the darkness where my light couldn't reach. His footsteps faded until I could no longer hear them, leaving me standing at the base of Firewatch Tower 47 with an unsettled feeling in my gut. Something wasn't right about Jacob's story. Pine Ridge was a well-marked popular campground only a couple miles from the main road. How had he gotten so lost? And those clothes, they looked like they'd been through more than just a day hike gone wrong. I climbed back up the spiral staircase to my post, each wooden step creaking under my weight. Inside the cabin, I checked my watch, just past midnight. I made a note in my log about the encounter, documenting the time and Jacob's description. If he was genuinely lost, I wanted a record of having provided assistance. The isolation of the tower felt more pronounced after human contact. I sat at my desk, the radio equipment silent, the windows on all sides showing nothing but darkness beyond the glass. I picked up my binoculars and did another scan of the horizon, looking for any sign of smoke or fire, though it was difficult to see much at night. 20 minutes later, I heard it. More footsteps. Different ones this time, more measured, deliberate, not the panicked stumbling of Jacob Franklin. I grabbed my flashlight again and moved to the observation deck. Shining the beam down, I caught sight of another figure emerging from the trees. This one moved with purpose, his steps confident despite the darkness. "Hello," I called down. The beam illuminated a man in a tan jacket. He was solidly built, around 6 feet tall, with closely cropped dark blonde hair. Unlike Jacob, his clothes showed no signs of distress or damage. He looked up at my light with unnervingly calm gray eyes. "Evening," he called up, his voice controlled and measured. I seemed to have lost my way. I descended the stairs again, keeping my flashlight trained on him. As I reached the bottom, I noticed how still he stood, barely shifting his weight as he waited. "I'm Dylan Romero," he said when I approached. His face was clean-shaven with a prominent jawline. "I'm trying to get back to Pine Ridge Campground. Can you point me in the right direction?" The same destination as Jacob. The coincidence made my skin prickle. "Pine Ridge?" I repeated. "That's the second person tonight looking for that campground." Dylan's expression didn't change. "Is that so?" "Yeah, about 20 minutes ago. Guy named Jacob Franklin." Dylan gave a small nod but offered no further comment. His lack of surprise or curiosity struck me as odd. "Pine Ridge is 4 miles east," I said, pointing to the same trail I'd directed Jacob toward. "Follow the yellow markers on the trees. The trail is pretty straightforward." "Thank you," Dylan said, his words perfectly enunciated. He turned to leave, taking a few steps toward the trail. Then he stopped abruptly. He stood completely still for several seconds, as if listening for something I couldn't hear. Without warning or explanation, Dylan spun around and headed in the opposite direction, the same path Jacob had taken earlier. "Hey!" I called after him. "That's not the way to Pine Ridge." Dylan kept walking, ignoring me completely. "Sir, Mr. Romero!" I shouted. "You're going the wrong way." He never looked back, never acknowledged me. Within moments, he vanished into the darkness of the forest. I stood there, flashlight beam pointed uselessly at the spot where he'd disappeared. What the hell was going on? 2 lost hikers in one night, both asking for directions to the same place, and then the second one deliberately going the wrong way, following the path of the first. I climbed back up to the tower, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. Was Dylan following Jacob? Why? And why pretend to be lost if he knew exactly where he was going? I added this second encounter to my log, noting the time and Dylan's description. I spent the rest of the night on edge, scanning the forest below more frequently than necessary, listening for any unusual sounds. But the forest remained quiet. The next morning, I radioed Leo Shepard during my scheduled 0700 report. Tower 47 to base, over. The radio crackled. This is base. Go ahead, 47. Morning weather conditions are clear, visibility 15 miles, wind from the southwest at 5 miles per hour, temperature 62 degrees, no smoke or fire activity observed. I paused, then added, I had 2 unusual visitor incidents last night I wanted to report. Visitors? Leo's gruff voice came back. What kind of visitors? I explained about Jacob and Dylan, their strange behavior, and how Dylan had followed Jacob's path rather than taking the directions to Pine Ridge. There was a long pause before Leo responded. Probably just hikers who got turned around. Nothing to worry about. But the second guy deliberately went the wrong. Harris, Leo cut me off. Part of being on Firewatch is dealing with lost hikers. It happens. Maybe they were camping together and got separated. Maybe they were meeting up somewhere else. Not our concern, unless they start a fire. It just seems strange. Focus on your job, Harris. Keep your eyes on the forest for smoke. That's what we're paying you for. Base out. The radio went silent. I sat back in my chair, frustrated by Leo's dismissive response. Sure, dealing with lost hikers might be routine, but there was nothing routine about what I'd witnessed. The next 2 days passed without incident. I maintained my schedule, scanning for smoke, checking weather readings, making my radio reports. But I couldn't shake the uneasiness from those strange encounters. I found myself frequently looking in the direction where Jacob and Dylan had disappeared, half expecting to see them emerge from the trees again. On the morning of the 3rd day after the encounters, I was at my desk reviewing weather data when I heard it. The distinctive thump, thump, thump of helicopter rotors. I stepped onto the observation deck, scanning the sky until I spotted it. A dark, military-style helicopter approaching from the north. It wasn't unusual to see Forest Service helicopters, especially during fire season, but this one was different, larger, painted a matte black instead of the usual green or white of government aircraft. I grabbed my binoculars and tracked its movement. The helicopter flew low over the treetops, following what appeared to be a deliberate course. About half a mile from my tower, it slowed and began to descend into a small clearing. Through my binoculars, I watched it land. The rotors continued to spin as the side door slid open. 3 men in dark clothing jumped out, moving with practiced efficiency. They unloaded a large wooden crate from the helicopter's cargo hold, carefully lowering it to the ground. The crate was about the size of a refrigerator, made of rough wood with metal reinforcements at the corners. The men positioned it at the edge of the clearing, then quickly returned to the helicopter. Within minutes, they were airborne again, the helicopter rising above the trees and banking away to the north, the same direction from which it had come. I kept my binoculars trained on the clearing long after the sound of rotors had faded. The wooden crate sat there, alone and out of place in the wilderness. No markings I could see from this distance, no obvious reason for its delivery to such a remote location. I lowered my binoculars, my mind filled with questions. What was in that crate? Why deliver it to the middle of nowhere? And was there any connection to the strange hikers from 3 nights ago? The forest had just gotten a lot more interesting and a lot more concerning. After 4 days in the tower, I decided to investigate the crate the helicopter had delivered. I had reported it to Leo during my morning check-in, but his response had been predictably dismissive. Just keep an eye on the horizon for smoke, Harris. That's your job. The clearing was about half a mile east of my position. I waited until after my evening report at 7, then grabbed my backpack with water, a protein bar, my flashlight, and a small first aid kit. The sun hadn't set yet, but it hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees as I made my way down the spiral staircase. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call and the soft crunch of pine needles under my boots. I followed the narrow trail that branched east from the main path, pushing aside low-hanging branches and stepping carefully over exposed roots. My mind kept returning to those 2 strange hikers from a few nights ago, Jacob with his torn clothes and haunted expression, and Dylan, who had deliberately gone the wrong way despite my warnings. After about 15 minutes of hiking, I reached the edge of the clearing where I'd watched the helicopter land. The space was roughly circular, maybe 70 feet across, with tall grass flattened in a spiral pattern from the helicopter's downdraft. The crate sat exactly where the men had left it, against the tree line on the far side. I approached cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of recent activity. Nothing seemed disturbed. The crate was larger than I'd estimated from the tower, about the size of a refrigerator, made of rough wooden planks with metal reinforcements at the corners. I circled it slowly, looking for shipping labels or any indication of its contents or origin. The wood was unmarked except for one side, which bore a simple black circle logo, perfectly round and about the size of my palm. No text, no numbers, just a solid black disc painted directly onto the wood. I ran my fingers over it. The paint felt thick and slightly textured. I noticed that the lid of the crate wasn't fully secured. The top panel had been nailed down, but one corner was loose, with enough space to lift it slightly. I hesitated, remembering Leo's instruction to focus solely on fire detection duties, but curiosity won out. I wedged my fingers under the loose corner and pulled upward. The wood creaked as I lifted the lid enough to peer inside. The crate contained what looked like fine black powder, similar to ash but darker and more uniform in texture. I reached in and touched it gingerly with my index finger. The substance felt waxy and strangely cold. Not at all what I expected. When I pulled my hand back, the powder clung to my fingertip in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as if it were adhering to my skin rather than simply sticking to it. I tried to brush it off, but it remained stubbornly attached. I spit on my finger and rubbed it against my pants, but the black substance only smeared, leaving dark stains on both my skin and my khakis. I took out my water bottle and poured some over my hand, rubbing vigorously, but the stain merely lightened slightly without disappearing completely. The whole thing felt wrong. Why would anyone airlift a crate of strange black powder into a national forest and just leave it there? I carefully lowered the lid back into place and stepped away from the crate, still trying to clean my fingers. The sun had nearly set by then, and the clearing was bathed in the fading orange light of dusk. I needed to get back to the tower before full darkness set in. As I turned to leave, I noticed something odd about the grass near the crate. It seemed darker, as if the black powder had somehow leaked out and stained the ground beneath it. But when I looked closer, I saw that it wasn't a stain at all. The grass itself appeared to be dying, turning black from the tips down toward the roots. I hurried back along the trail, occasionally checking my fingers in the fading light. The black stain remained, a stark contrast against my skin. Back at the tower, I climbed the stairs and immediately went to the small sink in the kitchenette. I scrubbed my hands with soap and hot water for several minutes, but the stains on my fingers remained, though somewhat faded. Whatever this substance was, it had properties beyond ordinary powder or ash. I sat at my desk and picked up the radio handset. It was after 9 now, but I needed to report what I'd found. "Base, this is Tower 47. Come in. Over." After a moment of static, Leo's voice came through, sounding irritated. "This is Base. Harris, you already made your evening report. What is it now? Over." "Sir, I investigated that crate that was delivered by helicopter yesterday. It contains some kind of black powder substance that sticks to skin and doesn't wash off easily. No identifying marks except a black circle logo. Over." There was a long pause before Leo responded, his voice now sharp and cold. "You were instructed to remain at your post and focus on fire detection. You have no authorization to investigate anything in that forest beyond your assigned duties. Leave the crate alone and mind your own business. Is that clear?" "Over." His tone took me by surprise. "Yes, sir. But shouldn't we report this to—" "That's enough, Harris," Leo cut me off. "Return to your assigned duties. Base out." The radio went silent. I sat back in my chair, staring at the black stains on my fingers. Leo's reaction seemed excessive, almost as if he already knew about the crate and didn't want me involved. I completed my regular evening scan of the horizon, noting nothing unusual in my logbook, then tried to distract myself by reading one of the paperbacks I'd brought along. But concentration was impossible. Every few minutes I found myself looking at my stained fingers or glancing out the windows into the darkness beyond. Around midnight I was sitting at my desk reviewing weather data when I first heard it, a sound like whispers coming from somewhere in the forest below. I stepped out onto the observation deck and listened intently. The whispers seemed to be coming from multiple directions, too distant to make out any words, but definitely human voices. I grabbed my flashlight and swept its beam across the tree line, but saw nothing unusual. The whispering continued, sometimes fading almost to nothing, then growing slightly louder, as if people were moving through the forest, carrying on hushed conversations. A twig snapped loudly somewhere to the east, followed by the unmistakable sound of leaves rustling under footsteps. I aimed my flashlight directly toward the sound. The moment the light hit that area, everything went completely silent. I held my breath and listened, but heard nothing more for several long seconds. Then the whispers began again, this time from the opposite direction. I swung my flashlight around quickly, and once again the sounds stopped the instant the light reached them. This pattern continued for over an hour. Whispers, movement sounds, silence when illuminated, then new sounds from a different direction. I couldn't see anyone or anything moving in the forest, yet the sounds were unmistakable. Eventually, I retreated inside the cabin and locked the door, something I hadn't felt the need to do until now. I sat on my cot with the flashlight in my hand, listening to the occasional whispers that still managed to penetrate the closed windows. A growing uneasiness settled over me. Was I becoming paranoid from the isolation? 4 days alone in a tower might be affecting my mind more than I'd anticipated. But the black stains on my fingers were real enough, tangible evidence that I'd encountered something unusual. I stared at my hands in the dim light of the cabin. What was happening in this forest? The strange hikers who appeared in the middle of the night, the mysterious crate with its black powder, Leo's dismissive attitude, and now these whispers from the darkness. None of it made sense. I lay back on my cot, exhausted but too unsettled to sleep. The rational part of my brain suggested that stress and isolation were causing me to overreact to ordinary forest sounds. But another part of me, a more primitive instinct, insisted that something truly strange was happening in the forest around me. I spotted her through the binoculars just after sunset on my 6th night at the tower, a splash of bright red moving between the dark tree trunks. So out of place it seemed like a hallucination at first. I adjusted the focus, convinced I was seeing things after nearly a week of isolation and strange encounters. But she was real. A woman in a red dress walking through the forest, moving with deliberate steps despite wearing what looked like high heels. The absurdity of it struck me immediately. Who wears heels in a national forest? She wasn't stumbling or struggling with the uneven ground either. She moved with an unsettling precision, weaving between trees and over fallen logs as if the forest floor were a smooth sidewalk. I watched her progress for several minutes as she made her way directly toward the tower, not wandering like someone lost, but moving with purpose, as if she knew exactly where she was going. My pulse quickened. After the strange men in the night, the helicopter dropping that crate with its black powder and the whispers in the darkness, this felt like part of the same puzzle. I set down the binoculars when she got close enough to see clearly with my naked eye. She stopped at the base of the tower and looked up. Even from 70 feet above, I could make out her features in the fading light. Long, dark hair falling over her shoulders, pale skin that seemed to glow against the red of her dress, and large eyes that reflected nothing. "Hello?" I called down, my voice breaking the evening silence. "Can I help you?" She tilted her head slightly, still looking up at me. "My name is Natalie Sawyer," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite its flat, emotionless tone. "I don't need help." The way she spoke sent a chill through me. No inflection, no natural rise and fall, just words delivered with mechanical precision. "Are you sure? It's getting dark and you're not exactly dressed for hiking," I said, gesturing at her outfit even though I wasn't sure she could see the movement. "The nearest campground is miles away." "I know where I am," she replied in that same monotone. "I don't need assistance." I hesitated, then asked, "Where did you come from? There aren't any roads nearby." She didn't answer my question. She just stood there, looking up at me with those vacant eyes. "Look, it's not safe to be out in these woods alone at night," I tried again. "I can call someone to help you get back to wherever you're staying." "That won't be necessary," she said. Then without another word, she turned and began walking back the way she'd come, her red dress vivid against the darkening forest. I watched her go, baffled by the encounter. Her heels should have sunk into the soft earth with each step, but she moved as easily as if she were on pavement. I grabbed the binoculars again and tracked her retreating figure until the trees began to swallow her up. The whole thing felt wrong. First Jacob Franklin, with his torn clothes and frightened eyes, then Dylan Romero following the same path but going the wrong way, the helicopter with its strange cargo, and now this woman in a cocktail dress wandering through a national forest at night. None of it made sense. I was about to turn away when I heard it, a piercing scream tearing through the quiet forest. It came from the direction Natalie had disappeared, a sound of pure terror that made my skin crawl. I dropped the binoculars onto the desk and grabbed my flashlight. My hand closed around the radio next, clipping it to my belt as I rushed to the stairs. I took them two at a time, nearly losing my footing in my hurry to reach the bottom. The forest had grown darker in the few minutes since Natalie had left. I clicked on my flashlight and swept its beam across the tree line where I'd last seen her. "Natalie," I called out, my voice sounding small against the vastness of the forest. "Natalie, are you okay?" No response came back, just the normal sounds of the forest at night, the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. I hesitated at the base of the tower, remembering Leo's instructions to focus only on fire detection. But someone might be hurt. I couldn't just ignore a scream like that. I started walking toward where I'd heard the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness ahead of me. The beam caught on tree trunks, undergrowth, fallen logs, normal forest features that now seemed ominous in the dark. "Natalie," I called again, louder this time. "If you can hear me, say something." I moved deeper into the trees, scanning the ground for any sign of disturbance. Broken branches, disturbed earth, anything that might indicate someone had passed through or struggled here. But the forest floor looked untouched. I kept going, sweeping my light back and forth methodically. I should have found something by now. Footprints from those high heels at the very least. The ground was soft enough that they should have left clear impressions. But there was nothing. No footprints. No scraps of red fabric caught on branches. No signs of a struggle that might explain that terrified scream. I spent nearly an hour searching in widening circles from where I thought I'd last seen her. I checked behind trees, in small clearings, even called her name until my throat felt raw. But it was as if Natalie Sawyer had simply vanished into thin air. Eventually, I had to admit defeat. I stood in the silent forest, flashlight in hand, completely baffled. I'd seen her clearly. We'd spoken. I'd heard her scream. But now there was absolutely no evidence that she'd ever been here. I made my way back to the tower, my mind racing through possibilities. Could she have been some kind of hallucination? Was I losing my grip after nearly a week of isolation and strange encounters? The black stains on my fingers from the crate's powder caught my eye as I climbed the stairs, a reminder that at least some of what I'd experienced was definitely real. but Natalie Sawyer in her bright red dress and impossible heels, walking through the forest and disappearing without a trace. I couldn't make sense of it. The memory of her vacant eyes and emotionless voice stayed with me as I locked the tower door behind me, wondering what the hell was happening in these woods. I spotted him through my binoculars during the evening scan. A man in a dark business suit standing perfectly still among the trees, facing the tower. At first I thought he might be lost like the others, but something about his stillness made my skin crawl. Most people shift their weight, look around, check their phones. This guy did none of that. Just stood there, staring up at my position. I adjusted the focus on my binoculars, trying to make out his features. The fading light made it difficult, but I could see he wore a crisp black suit that looked completely out of place in the wilderness. No hiking boots or outdoor gear, just formal business attire, as if he'd stepped out of a corporate meeting and materialized in the middle of the forest. "Hello?" I called down from the observation deck, my voice echoing through the trees. "Can I help you?" No response, not even a twitch. I tried again, louder this time. "If you're lost, I can give you directions." The man remained frozen, like a statue someone had placed among the pines. His arms hung at his sides and his face was tilted upward toward the tower. I couldn't make out his expression from this distance, but something about that unnatural stillness sent a chill through me despite the warm evening air. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I kept checking through the binoculars, certain he would eventually move, speak, or acknowledge me somehow. But 30 minutes in, he remained in exactly the same position. Not a single adjustment or shift in posture. After 45 minutes of this bizarre standoff, I started to wonder if what I was seeing was even real. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or some kind of Forest Service equipment I was misinterpreting, but each time I checked with the binoculars, he was still there. Still staring, still motionless. At the 1 hour mark, I'd had enough. The black stains on my fingers from the mysterious crate hadn't faded. The memory of Natalie Sawyer's scream still echoed in my head. The whispers from the forest at night hadn't stopped. And now this, another inexplicable visitor who seemed to be following no rules of normal human behavior. I grabbed my flashlight, slipped it into my pocket, and headed for the spiral staircase. After 8 days of weird encounters and growing unease, I was done with watching from a distance. I needed answers. The wooden steps creaked under my boots as I made my way down. With each step, I rehearsed what I would say to the man in the suit. "Who are you? What do you want? Why are you standing there staring at my tower? Why is everyone in this forest acting so damn strange?" I hit the ground and set off in the direction where I'd spotted him, moving with purpose through the underbrush. The spot wasn't far, maybe 200 yards from the base of the tower through a stand of pine trees. The evening light was fading fast, but I still had enough visibility to make my way without the flashlight. As I approached the location, I slowed my pace, suddenly aware of how vulnerable I was out here alone. What if this guy was dangerous? What if he wasn't alone? I listened carefully but heard only the usual forest sounds. The rustle of leaves, distant bird calls, the soft whisper of wind through the pines. I reached the exact spot where the man had been standing. Nothing. No one. "Hello," I called out, turning in a slow circle. "Is anyone here?" Silence answered me. I pulled out my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the ground and surrounding trees. The suited man was gone. Completely vanished. I checked behind trees, looked up branches, scanned the perimeter in widening circles. What struck me most was the complete absence of evidence. The forest floor here was soft with a layer of pine needles and loose soil, perfect for capturing footprints, but there were none. No depressions where someone might have stood for an hour, no broken twigs, no disturbed vegetation, nothing to suggest anyone had been here at all. I knelt down, running my fingers over the ground where he should have left some mark. The earth was undisturbed, as if no one had stood in this spot for weeks. "This isn't possible," I muttered to myself, standing up and brushing off my hands. I expanded my search, moving in concentric circles around the spot. Maybe I had the location wrong. Maybe he had moved just before I came down. I spent 20 minutes combing the surrounding area, checking behind every tree trunk and bush large enough to hide a person. Nothing. No one. No evidence. The light was nearly gone now, the forest darkening around me. I clicked my flashlight on full beam and made one last sweep of the area. The shadows between the trees seemed to deepen and shift as my light passed over them, but there was no sign of the man in the suit. I headed back toward the tower, moving faster than I'd like to admit. Every snap of a twig in the darkness made me jump. Every rustle in the underbrush seemed threatening. The forest that had become familiar over the past 8 days suddenly felt alien and hostile. Back at the base of the tower, I paused and looked up at the cabin 70 feet above, its windows glowing with the light I'd left on. It looked like a beacon of safety now, my only connection to the normal world. I climbed the stairs quickly, not looking back at the darkening forest behind me. Inside the cabin, I locked the door and dropped into the chair at my desk. My hands were shaking slightly as I picked up the binoculars and scanned the area where the man had been standing. The forest was now cloaked in darkness, revealing nothing. I put the binoculars down and stared at my reflection in the window glass. 8 days. 8 days of isolation, with only brief radio contact with Leo. 8 days of strange encounters that defied explanation. Jacob Franklin with his torn clothes and frightened eyes. Dylan Romero following the wrong path deliberately. The helicopter dropping off that crate with its black powder that still stained my fingers. Natalie Sawyer in her red dress who vanished without a trace. The whispers in the night. And now a man in a business suit who could stand motionless for an hour and disappear without leaving any evidence he was ever there. Was I losing my mind? I'd read about the psychological effects of isolation, how the human brain isn't wired for extended periods of solitude, how the mind can start to play tricks, creating stimuli where none exist. But these experiences felt so real. The conversations, the details I observed, the black stain still visible on my fingers that no amount of scrubbing would remove. I held my hand up to the light, examining the dark smudges on my fingertips. This was real. I hadn't imagined touching that strange powder in the crate. But if that was real, what about everything else? Maybe stress was making me paranoid. Maybe I was connecting unrelated events and building them into something sinister. A lost hiker, a search party member, a helicopter making a supply drop, a woman who took a wrong turn, a forest ranger doing rounds in formal attire for some reason. But even as I tried to rationalize each encounter, I knew I was grasping at straws. None of it made sense. None of it followed normal patterns of human behavior. And the disappearances, the way Natalie had vanished without a trace, the way the suited man had been there 1 minute and gone the next with no evidence, those couldn't be explained away so easily. I turned back to my logbook and wrote down the details of tonight's encounter while they were still fresh in my mind. Time, location, description, duration of observation, my search of the area, the complete lack of evidence. I needed to document everything, if only to convince myself later that I hadn't imagined it all. As I wrote, I realized my confidence in my own perceptions was crumbling. What was real and what wasn't? Was I actually seeing these things? Or was my mind creating elaborate hallucinations to cope with the monotony and isolation of fire tower duty? I closed the logbook and leaned back in my chair, suddenly exhausted. The certainty I'd felt about the world 8 days ago had evaporated, replaced by doubt that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. I was a rational person. I believed in what I could see, touch, and verify, but nothing about the past 8 days could be verified. Nothing made sense. And I was starting to question everything, including myself. I witnessed the most terrifying event of my assignment on the 9th night. The day had dragged endlessly, each hour stretching longer than the last as I fought against my growing paranoia. My fingers still bore the stubborn black stains from the crate's powder, a constant reminder that at least some of what I'd experienced was real. The suited man who had stood motionless for nearly an hour before vanishing without a trace continued to haunt my thoughts. I kept checking and rechecking the forest through my binoculars, half expecting to see him reappear in the exact same spot, still as a statue. As darkness fell across the forest, I completed my evening radio report to Leo. He barely acknowledged me, responding only with terse instructions to maintain my firewatch duties. Nothing more. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deepening shades of blue before surrendering to night. I stood on the observation deck, scanning the darkening tree line through my binoculars when I noticed movement. At first, I thought it might be animals. Deer, perhaps, or maybe even a bear. But as I adjusted my focus, my breath caught. A figure emerged from between the trees to the east. It wore what looked like a black cloak or robe, with a deep hood obscuring any facial features. The figure moved with an unnatural smoothness across the uneven forest floor, seeming to glide rather than walk. "What the hell?" I whispered, tracking the figure's movement. Before I could process what I was seeing, another identical figure appeared from the west, then another from the north, and another. They converged toward the tower from different directions, their movements synchronized in a way that made my skin crawl. I counted them as they emerged from the tree line. 5, 8, 10, 12. At least 12 figures in black cloaks, all heading directly toward my tower. They moved with impossible grace over fallen logs and uneven ground, as though the terrain itself bent to accommodate them. The figures formed a perfect circle around the base of my tower, each one equidistant from the others. I stood frozen on the observation deck, 70 feet above them, my knuckles white as I gripped the railing. "Who are you?" I called down, my voice sounding thin and weak in the night air. "This is a restricted area." None of them looked up. None of them responded. Their hoods remained pointed downward, concealing whatever lay beneath. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed the beam down at the circle of figures. The light seemed to dim as it reached them, barely illuminating their black cloaks. Then it started, the chanting. Low at first, barely audible, a murmur that might have been mistaken for wind through the trees. But it grew steadily, voices weaving together in a language I couldn't recognize. Not Latin, not any European language I knew. The syllables had a harsh, clicking quality that seemed impossible for human vocal cords to produce. The sound rose up the tower like a physical thing, wrapping around me. I backed away from the railing, retreating into the cabin, but the chanting followed me inside. It penetrated the glass windows, the wooden walls. I tried the radio, frantically turning dials. "Base, this is Tower 47. I have multiple intruders surrounding the tower. I need immediate assistance. Over." Only static answered me. I tried again, shouting now, but the static just grew louder, matching the intensity of the chanting outside. I returned to the window, watching in horror as the cloaked figures began to sway. Their movements were synchronized, a gentle rocking that didn't match the rhythm of their chanting. They weren't moving their feet. The bottom edges of their cloaks remained perfectly still while their upper bodies swayed. It looked as if they were floating slightly above the ground. The chanting grew louder, drowning out the normal sounds of the forest. No cricket chirps, no rustling leaves, no distant owl calls. Just the relentless, rhythmic chanting in that unknown language. The harmony they created was both beautiful and terrible. Notes that shouldn't have been able to exist together somehow merging into something that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I grabbed my binoculars again, trying to see beneath their hoods, to catch any glimpse of a face, but the darkness within seemed absolute, a void deeper than mere shadow. The swaying intensified. The figures began to move their arms in unison, raising them slowly toward the tower. Their sleeves fell back, revealing hands that were... I dropped the binoculars. I didn't want to see. I didn't want to know. The chanting reached a fever pitch, so loud now that I could feel it vibrating in my chest, rattling my ribcage. It was like standing next to massive speakers at a concert. But instead of music, it was that terrible, beautiful, impossible language. I covered my ears with my hands, pressing hard enough to hurt, but it made no difference. The sound wasn't just coming through my ears. It seemed to pass directly into my body, into my bones. The cabin began to vibrate. Items on the desk rattled. The glass in the windows hummed. I fell to my knees, hands still clamped over my ears, eyes squeezed shut. The chanting reached a deafening crescendo, the voices somehow continuing to rise in both volume and pitch beyond what should have been possible, just when I thought my eardrums would burst, when I was certain I would lose consciousness from the overwhelming sensory assault. Everything stopped. The silence hit me like a physical blow. I opened my eyes, slowly lowered my hands from my ears. The sudden absence of sound was almost as disorienting as the chanting had been. My ears rang in the quiet. I crawled to the window, pulled myself up using the sill, and looked down at the base of the tower. I looked down after the silence fell. The 12 cloaked figures had vanished completely. Not a single one remained at the base of the tower. No footprints in the soft earth, no broken twigs, no disturbed vegetation. Nothing to indicate they had ever been there at all. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, scanning the entire circumference of the tower base. Empty. The forest stood quiet and still, as if the deafening chant that had vibrated through my bones just moments ago had never happened. My hands shook as I picked up the binoculars I'd dropped. I swept them across the tree line, searching for any movement, any hint of those black robes gliding between trunks. Nothing. Just darkness and silent trees. "Hello?" I called down, my voice cracking. The word hung in the night air, unanswered. I backed away from the window, nearly tripping over my own feet. My heart hammered in my chest. What had I just seen? What were those things? And what had they wanted? The radio. I needed to call for help. I stumbled to the desk and grabbed the handset, pressing the transmit button with trembling fingers. "Base, this is Tower 47, emergency. I need immediate assistance." My words tumbled out in a rush. There were people here, figures in black robes. They surrounded the tower. They were chanting. I don't know what they... Only static answered me. The harsh white noise filled the cabin, growing louder with each attempt. "Base, do you copy? Leo? Anyone?" More static. I adjusted the frequency dial, trying other channels. Nothing but the same electric hiss. I slammed the handset down. I backed myself into the corner of the cabin, as far from the windows as possible. The black stains on my fingers stood out starkly against my pale skin. I rubbed at them again, a useless gesture I'd repeated dozens of times since touching that powder. They remained unchanged, a permanent reminder that at least some of what I'd experienced was real. I stayed there, huddled in that corner through the endless night. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the tower, every rustle of wind through the trees outside sent fresh jolts of adrenaline through my system. I kept the flashlight clutched in my hand, its beam pointing at the locked door. The hours crawled by. I checked my watch obsessively, counting down to dawn. 4 hours, 3 hours, 2. The darkness seemed to press against the windows, trying to find a way in. When the first pale light of dawn finally appeared on the horizon, I nearly wept with relief. The gray pre-dawn slowly pushed back the darkness, revealing the familiar landscape of pine trees and undergrowth. No black-robed figures, no sign of anything unusual, As the sun rose higher, I allowed myself to move from my corner. My muscles protested, stiff from hours of tense immobility. I approached the windows cautiously, scanning the area below in the growing light. Everything looked normal, just a forest waking up to a new day. I heard the sound of a vehicle approaching along the access road around 8 o'clock. I grabbed the binoculars, focusing on the dirt track that wound through the trees. A Green Ranger truck came into view, kicking up dust as it approached the tower. Leo's truck. My relief was so intense it made me lightheaded. I watched Leo park at the base of the tower and step out, looking up at the cabin with his usual stern expression. He was wearing his standard uniform, his ranger hat firmly in place. The most beautiful, normal sight I could imagine. I grabbed my duffel bag and started shoving my belongings into it haphazardly. Clothes, books, toiletries. I didn't care how they went in, just that they did. I needed to get out of this tower. I needed to be around people, noise, lights, all the things that made up normal human existence. I took one last look around the cabin to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything important. My gaze fell on the logbook where I documented everything. Jacob Franklin with his torn clothes, Dylan Romero going the wrong way, the helicopter, the crate with its black powder, Natalie Sawyer in her red dress, the suited man who stood without moving, and finally, last night's cloaked figures, a record of my descent into either madness or something far worse. I grabbed the logbook and stuffed it into my bag as well. Then I hurried down the spiral staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time, my duffel banging against my back. Leo stood at the bottom, arms crossed over his chest, watching my clumsy descent. "Eager to get back to civilization, Harris?" he asked as my feet hit the ground. "Leo," I gasped, dropping my bag. "Thank God you're here. Last night, there were people, figures in black robes. They surrounded the tower. They were chanting something. I tried to radio but couldn't get through. And before that, there was a woman in a red dress and a man in a suit who disappeared, and that crate with the black powder that the helicopter dropped off." I held up my stained fingers as evidence. Leo's expression didn't change. His eyes flicked briefly to my fingers, then back to my face. "Sounds like you've had an eventful week," he said flatly. "You don't believe me," I said. It wasn't a question. Leo sighed. "Look, Harris, isolation does things to people. The mind plays tricks when you're alone too long. It's why we rotate staff regularly." "I'm not making this up," I insisted. "There were hikers that first night, Jacob Franklin, and then another man looking for him. There was a helicopter that dropped off a crate. I went to look at it, and there was this black powder inside." "You were assigned to watch for fires," Leo cut me off, "not to investigate random hikers or imaginary helicopters." It wasn't imaginary. None of it was. I saw them with my own eyes. Leo's face softened slightly. "Harris, I've been doing this job for 25 years. Every season, at least one watchman comes down with stories. Strange lights, weird noises, mysterious figures. It's the isolation. It's the forest. It gets to people." I stared at him, my mouth hanging open. He thought I was crazy. He thought I'd hallucinated everything. "The crate," I said desperately. "It's in a clearing about half a mile east of here. I can show you." The grass around it was dying, turning black from the tips to the roots. "I need to get up there and check the equipment before the next shift arrives," Leo said, gesturing toward the tower. "Your replacement will be here tomorrow. You're done for now." He stepped around me and started up the stairs. "What about my report?" I called after him. "Drop it off at Pine Ridge Station on your way out," he said without looking back. "Standard procedure." I stood there for a moment, watching him climb. Then I picked up my bag and walked to my car, parked where I'd left it 9 days ago. 9 days that had changed everything. The drive back toward town was surreal. The forest road gave way to a paved highway, then to streets with buildings and people and traffic lights. Normal things. Safe things. With each mile, The tower and its horrors receded, becoming less immediate if not less disturbing. I pulled into the parking lot of the Pine Ridge Ranger Station, a modern single-story building with large windows and a stone facade. I sat in my car for a few minutes, gathering myself. I needed to appear normal, composed, not like someone who'd spent the night huddled in a corner, terrified of chanting figures that disappeared into thin air. Inside, the station was bright and busy. 2 rangers stood behind a counter helping tourists with maps. A family with hiking gear waited on benches near the door. The normalcy of it all was both comforting and jarring after my isolation. I approached the counter and handed over my logbook to a ranger I didn't recognize. "End of shift report from Tower 47, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thanks," the ranger said, barely glancing at it. "If you could wait a few minutes, we need you to sign some paperwork." I nodded and moved to the waiting area. The walls were covered with posters about fire safety, wildlife identification charts, and trail maps. A large bulletin board hung near the entrance, crowded with notices, permits, and flyers. My eyes drifted over the bulletin board absently at first, then stopped abruptly on a section labeled Missing Persons. Several flyers were pinned there, showing faces of people who had disappeared in the area over the years. I stepped closer, my heart suddenly pounding. And there he was. The flyer showed a color photograph of a man with disheveled brown hair and wide-set, anxious blue eyes. Jacob Franklin, the same man who had stumbled into the circle of my flashlight beam on my 3rd night at the tower. The same torn t-shirt, the same nervous expression. I reached out with shaking hands and unpinned the flyer to read it more closely. Missing, Jacob Franklin, 34. Last seen at Pine Ridge Campground on July 15th, 2021. If you have any information, please contact 2021. 2 years ago, Jacob Franklin had been missing for 2 years. My knees went weak, and I had to grab the edge of the bulletin board to steady myself. If Jacob had been missing for 2 years, then who or what had I met that night at the tower? The black stains on my fingers seemed to darken as I stared at the flyer, the only physical evidence that what I'd experienced was real. Everything else could be explained away as hallucinations, as Leo had suggested, isolation playing tricks on my mind. But the stains remained, indelible marks from whatever had been in that crate. I looked back at the photograph of Jacob Franklin. His eyes seemed to stare directly into mine from the paper, filled with the same fear I'd seen that night when he emerged from the darkness. I read the flyer again, more carefully this time. The details hit me like a physical blow. Jacob Franklin, age 34, reported missing 2 years ago during a camping trip at Pine Ridge. The same forest where I'd been stationed. The same forest where I'd met him, or someone, just days ago. The photograph was unmistakable. Those wide, anxious blue eyes, the disheveled brown hair. Even the torn t-shirt matched exactly what I'd seen that night at the base of my tower. The same nervous expression, like he was being hunted. "Sir, your paperwork is ready." I barely heard the ranger's voice from the counter. My fingers trembled as I held the flyer, the black stains on my skin standing out in stark contrast against the white paper. My mind raced, trying to process what this meant. If Jacob Franklin had been missing for 2 years, who had I spoken to that night? Who had I given directions to? Who had walked away into the darkness of the forest? "Sir, are you okay?" The ranger's voice was closer now. I looked up, trying to compose myself. "This man," I said, holding up the flyer. "I saw him at my tower 3 nights ago." The ranger frowned, taking the paper from my shaking hands. "That's not possible. Jacob Franklin has been missing for 2 years. Search parties combed that entire area for weeks." "I know what I saw," I insisted, though my conviction was crumbling by the second. "He came to my tower asking for directions to Pine Ridge Campground. He was wearing these exact clothes, torn just like this." The ranger gave me a look I recognized all too well, the same look Leo had given me, concern mixed with doubt. The look you give someone whose grip on reality is slipping. Sometimes the isolation plays tricks on your mind, he said gently, handing the flyer back. It happens to the best of us. Why don't you get some rest? I took the flyer and folded it carefully, tucking it into my pocket. I signed whatever paperwork they put in front of me, my mind elsewhere. Everything I thought I knew was unraveling. Jacob Franklin, Dylan Romero, Natalie Sawyer in her red dress. The suited man, the cloaked figures with their impossible chanting. Had any of it been real? I walked out of the ranger station in a daze, squinting against the bright afternoon sunlight. My car sat in the parking lot, packed with my belongings. I slid into the driver's seat and just sat there staring at the dashboard. The keys dangled from my trembling fingers, the black stains a stark reminder that something had happened out there. The stains. They were real. I hadn't imagined them. I'd touched something in that crate, something that left a mark that wouldn't wash away. That had to mean something. But what about everything else? Jacob Franklin had been missing for 2 years. How could I have spoken to him? How could he have been wearing the same torn clothes from when he disappeared? I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, driving aimlessly at first. My apartment was an hour away, but I wasn't sure I was ready to go home yet. My mind kept replaying every strange encounter from the past 9 days, searching for logical explanations. Maybe Jacob's disappearance had been on my mind somehow. Maybe I'd seen his flyer before taking the job and forgotten about it. Maybe isolation and stress had caused me to hallucinate a person I'd seen in a missing persons report. But that didn't explain Dylan Romero deliberately walking in the wrong direction, or Natalie Sawyer's scream, or the cloaked figures surrounding the tower, or the black stains on my fingers. I glanced down at my hands on the steering wheel, those dark marks still visible on my skin. I'd scrubbed them for days with every soap and cleaner available, but they remained, slightly faded but undeniably present. Traffic lights and street signs blurred as I drove through town. I took the highway exit toward my apartment almost automatically, my body on autopilot while my mind struggled to make sense of everything. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot, the sun was setting. I sat in my car for several more minutes, unable to move. Coming back to normal life felt strange, as if I'd returned from another world entirely. The ordinary sounds of the complex, people talking, cars passing, someone playing music, seemed alien after days of forest silence punctuated only by whispers and chanting. I finally gathered my duffel bag and headed up to my apartment. The key stuck in the lock like it always did. The familiar stubbornness of it was almost comforting. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it 9 days ago. Mail piled on the counter, dishes in the sink I'd meant to wash before leaving, the clock on the microwave blinking from a power outage. Ordinary life. Normal life. I dropped my bag on the floor and collapsed onto my couch, suddenly exhausted. I hadn't slept properly since the night before Jacob appeared. My body ached with fatigue, but my mind refused to quiet down. I pulled out my phone and searched for Jacob Franklin missing Pine Ridge. Several news articles appeared, dating back 2 years. I clicked on one with his photograph. Local man missing after solo camping trip, the headline read. The article confirmed everything on the flyer. Jacob Franklin, 34, had gone camping alone at Pine Ridge Campground and never returned. His car had been found in the parking lot, his tent still set up at his campsite. Search efforts had continued for 3 weeks before being scaled back. The case remained open. I searched for Dylan Romero next, but found nothing. Same with Natalie Sawyer. If they were real people who had gone missing, there was no online record of it. I set my phone down and rubbed my eyes. The black stains caught my attention again. I went to the bathroom and tried once more to scrub them off with soap and hot water. They remained unchanged, a permanent reminder etched into my skin. In the mirror, I barely recognized myself. My eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. My face looked gaunt, older somehow. 9 days had aged me in ways I couldn't explain. I took a long shower, letting the hot water wash over me, trying to cleanse more than just my body. Afterward, I made myself a sandwich, not because I was hungry, but because I knew I should eat. I chewed mechanically, tasting nothing. Night fell, and with it came a familiar uneasiness. I checked the locks on my door and windows twice. I left lights on in every room. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every strange encounter in my mind. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Jacob Franklin's anxious face, Natalie Sawyer's emotionless eyes, the cloaked figures swaying in unison. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by dreams of whispers and chanting. I woke repeatedly, heart racing, certain I'd heard something in my apartment. Each time, I found nothing but ordinary shadows and silence. Morning light eventually filtered through my blinds. I'd survived the night, physically unharmed but fundamentally changed. Whatever had happened at Firewatch Tower 47, whether real, supernatural, or hallucination, had transformed me in ways I couldn't yet understand. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, staring at the black stains on my fingers. They were the only tangible evidence that something extraordinary had occurred. Everything else could be explained away as isolation-induced hallucinations or coincidences. But these marks remained. I knew I would never return to Pine Ridge Forest. No job, no amount of money could drag me back there. Yet I couldn't escape it either. The forest had followed me home, embedded itself under my skin like the black stains that refused to fade. I sipped my coffee, wincing at its bitterness. The normalcy of my apartment felt like a thin veneer, a fragile shell that could crack at any moment. The walls seemed too close, the ceiling too low after days of endless sky seen through the tower's windows. My phone rang, startling me so badly I spilled coffee across the table. An unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, my heart racing for no logical reason. When it rang again immediately, I reluctantly answered. Hello? Harris? It's Leo Shepard. My stomach dropped. How had he gotten my personal number? I hadn't listed it on any of my paperwork. I need to talk to you about your report, he continued when I didn't respond. Some inconsistencies we need to clear up. There were no inconsistencies, I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. I wrote down exactly what happened. Leo sighed. Look, I understand the isolation can be difficult, but these stories about missing people showing up at your tower, black powder, robed figures, we can't have this kind of thing in official reports. They're not stories, I insisted, looking down at my stained fingers. I saw what I saw. Your replacement arrived yesterday. No mention of black powder crates or dying grass. No stains. Nothing unusual at all. I gripped the phone tighter. Did you tell them to check the clearing half a mile east of the tower? Harris... His tone had shifted to something that sounded like pity. I sent a team to check. There's nothing there. No crate. No black powder. No circle of dead grass. The room seemed to tilt slightly. That's not possible. I was there. I touched it. I'm calling as a courtesy, Leo said. Your report has been filed as incomplete due to stress-related factors. If you want to continue working with the Forest Service in the future, I suggest you get some rest and put this whole thing behind you. The line went dead before I could respond. I set the phone down and stared at the spilled coffee, watching it pool around the base of my mug. No crate, no evidence. Nothing to corroborate what I'd experienced except the stains on my fingers, which could be explained away as anything. Paint, ink, dirt that wouldn't wash off. I spent the next few days in a fog, going through the motions of normal life without fully engaging with it. I bought groceries. I paid bills. I I called my sister and told her the job had gone fine, that I was just tired from the isolation. I didn't mention Jacob Franklin or the crate or the cloaked figures. What would be the point? A week after returning from Tower 47, I was unpacking the last of my duffel bag when I found the folded missing persons flyer I'd taken from the ranger station. Jacob Franklin stared up at me, his anxious expression frozen in time. I smoothed out the creases and pinned it to my refrigerator, a reminder that I wasn't completely crazy. That night, I dreamed of the forest, not nightmares of whispers and chanting, but ordinary dreams of pine trees and sunlight filtering through branches. I woke feeling more rested than I had in days. Over breakfast, I found myself drawing the black circle logo I'd seen on the crate. The simple design had burned itself into my memory. A perfect circle with no other markings. I drew it over and over on a notepad, as if repetition might reveal its meaning. On impulse, I searched online for black circle logo but got millions of useless results. I tried adding government and military, thinking of the helicopter that had delivered the crate, but found nothing that matched what I'd seen. I was about to give up when my phone pinged with a text message from another unknown number. "We need to talk about what you saw. Coffee shop on Main and 5th, 2 p.m. today." No name, no explanation of how they'd gotten my number. My first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity won out. What if someone else knew something? What if I wasn't alone in what I'd experienced? I arrived at the coffee shop 20 minutes early and chose a table with a clear view of both the entrance and the emergency exit. I ordered a coffee I didn't want just to have something to do with my hands. The black stains seemed more noticeable in the bright lighting, and I found myself curling my fingers inward to hide them. At exactly 2 o'clock, a woman walked in. Average height, brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, casual clothes, jeans and a gray sweater. Nothing remarkable except for the way she scanned the room, her eyes moving with practiced efficiency until they landed on me. She walked directly to my table and sat down without ordering. "Teddy Harris?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded, studying her face for any sign of recognition. Had I seen her before? At the ranger station, perhaps? "My name is Rebecca Marsh," she said, offering no handshake. "I believe you encountered something unusual at Firewatch Tower 47. "How do you know about that?" I asked. "And how did you get my number?" She ignored both questions. "The black powder. Did you touch it?" I uncurled my fingers, showing her the stains. "It won't come off." Rebecca didn't look surprised. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open to a blank page. "I need you to tell me everything that happened from the beginning, every detail you can remember." "Who are you?" I demanded. "Do you work for the Forest Service?" A slight smile crossed her face. "No. I don't work for any government agency you've heard of." "Then why should I tell you anything?" She closed her notebook and fixed me with an intense stare. "Because I believe you, Teddy. I believe Jacob Franklin came to your tower asking for directions 2 years after he went missing. I believe you found a crate of black powder that stained your skin. I believe you saw figures in robes chanting around your tower. And I believe you want answers." My coffee sat forgotten between us, growing cold. I did want answers, more than anything. "Start with Jacob Franklin," Rebecca said, opening her notebook again. "Tell me exactly what he said to you."